Cops extort money from elderly farmer not knowing his son is an FBI agent. Samuel Johnson, 78 years old, woke up like he always did, just before the sun touched the tips of the trees outside his bedroom window. His old bones creaked as he sat up, but his spirit was steady, just like the farm he had spent his whole life caring for. He didn't know that today would be different. He thought it would be like every other morning. Feeding the chickens, walking the rows of corn, maybe driving into town to pick up a few things. But life has a way of surprising us. And this time, that surprise would shake his quiet world in ways he never imagined. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapped around him like an old friend. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the sky was turning that soft pink he liked. He walked slowly to the barn, careful on the gravel, a metal bucket swinging in one hand. The chickens clucked when they saw him, like they knew breakfast was coming. He fed them, talking to them softly like he always did. "Morning, girls. Got some fresh feed for you." His voice was rough but kind. He checked the coop, collected a few eggs, and headed toward the vegetable patch to check his tomato plants. His land was his pride. Not big, not flashy, but healthy. Everything in straight rows, everything clean. The barn door freshly painted. The old tractor still running like a charm because he knew how to take care of things. Just like his father taught him. Just like he hoped to pass down to his own son someday. After finishing his morning work, Samuel went inside, washed his hands, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat by the window, the one that looked out over the front field. That's when he saw something strange. 2 police officers parked by the road. Their car wasn't moving, just sitting there, watching. Samuel squinted. He didn't recognize them. Not from around here, he thought. He took a slow sip of coffee. Maybe they were just passing through. But his gut told him something was off. He shrugged it off for the time being. Had to make a supply run into town. He grabbed his wallet, his list, and headed out in his old pickup truck. It rattled a little but ran smooth. He'd rebuilt the engine himself years ago. The drive into town was quiet. Pine trees lined the road. That good red Georgia dirt passed under his tires. He wasn't in a rush. He pulled into Parker's General Store. The bell above the door rang like always. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," Tommy called from behind the counter. Samuel gave him a small smile and nodded. "Morning, Tommy. I need some seed packets and sugar." As he shopped, a few other customers came in. Some nodded politely. Others kept their heads down, walked around him like he wasn't there. Samuel had grown used to it. A black man in a small southern town, some things hadn't changed, even after all these years. Tommy bagged his items and said, "You take care out there, Mr. Johnson." Samuel smiled again. "You too, son." Back in the truck, he placed the bag beside him, turned the key, and started back home. But he didn't make it far. Blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart jumped. Not because he'd done anything wrong. He never sped, always wore his belt, had current tags. But still, something about being pulled over made his hands tighten on the wheel. He pulled to the side slowly, carefully, rolled the window down, kept his hands visible. 2 officers approached, one on each side. "License and registration," one of them said sharply. No greeting, no smile. Samuel nodded and reached for the papers from the glove box. "Taillights out," the other one said. Samuel paused. "Sir, I checked all my lights yesterday. Everything was working just fine." The officer on the driver's side leaned in, closer. "You calling my partner a liar?" Samuel's throat went dry. "No, sir, just sharing what I know." They made him get out of the truck. He stood by the road, sun on his face, heart beating too fast. Cars passed slowly. He felt like everyone was looking. They inspected the truck, called it routine, told him he was lucky this time. Handed his papers back carelessly. As they drove off, Samuel stayed standing there. The wind moved through the trees. The sound of birds seemed far away. Something had changed. Something deep. He got back into his truck, his hands still shaking, and drove home in silence. He didn't know yet, but this was only the beginning. Samuel didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the kitchen table long after the sun went down, the room lit by the soft yellow glow of a single bulb above him. His hands were wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, untouched since he poured it. The house was silent, too silent, and the only sound came from the steady tick of the wall clock and the distant call of a whip-poor-will outside his window. He kept going over it in his mind. The officers, their words, the way they looked at him like he was guilty before he even spoke. And for what? A taillight that wasn't even broken? Something about it didn't sit right. He had lived in this town his whole life. He'd worked this land with his bare hands, paid his taxes, helped neighbors, donated crops during tough years. He never once asked for trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had come looking for him. The next morning, the sun rose as usual, casting long shadows over his fields. But Samuel felt different. He moved slower. Not because of age, but because of the heaviness sitting on his chest. He tried to focus on his chores, watering the plants, checking the fencing, but his mind kept drifting. By late morning, he had just finished laying new mulch in his tomato beds when he heard it, the sound of tires crunching down his gravel driveway. He turned and wiped his hands on his work pants. The same patrol car, the same two officers. This time, they didn't stay on the road. They pulled right up to his barn like they owned the place. Samuel straightened his back and walked toward them. His heart was beating hard, but he kept his voice steady. "Morning, officers. Something I can help you with?" The taller one, Miller, his badge red, stepped out of the car with a clipboard in hand. His partner, Tucker, followed with that same smug look on his face. "We've received some complaints," Miller said. "Complaints?" Samuel frowned. "From who?" Miller shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We're just here to make sure everything's up to code. Safety inspections, zoning compliance. You know the drill." Samuel blinked. "I've been working this land for over 50 years. Never had a single complaint." "Well, times change," Tucker chimed in, already walking toward the barn. "And so do regulations." Samuel followed, watching as the two men moved across his land like they had the right. They poked at his fertilizer storage, glanced at his water system, looked at his chicken coop. They didn't take notes on anything real, just looked busy, creating a problem where none existed. At the barn, Miller clicked his tongue. "These setbacks from the property line, they're all wrong, way too close." "That barn's been there since before I was born," Samuel replied calmly. "The county approved it back in 1960. "Well," Miller said with a smirk, "looks like they missed something." Tucker walked out of the barn holding a rusted piece of wire. "What's this? Improper electrical grounding?" Samuel stared at him. "That's a piece of fencing wire. Nothing to do with the barn." They kept going like that for an hour, pointing out violations that made no sense. Finally, Miller stopped at the porch steps, looked at Samuel, and gave a tired sigh. "Look, Mr. Johnson," he said, his tone suddenly more relaxed. "We're not trying to make your life hard. But if these violations go on record, the county might have to shut your farm down until you fix them. Could take weeks, maybe longer." Samuel didn't speak. He just stared. "But," Miller continued, "there's a way to take care of this quietly. Avoid the red tape, keep things smooth." "How much?" Samuel asked softly. Tucker smiled. "2,000 should do it." Samuel didn't respond at first. He looked around, at his fields, his barn, the porch Grace had swept every Sunday morning. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll get it." Inside the house, he went to the pantry. He reached behind the flour and cornmeal canisters, pulling out a rusted coffee tin. He hadn't touched it in months. Inside was cash he'd been saving for a new irrigation system. Money he didn't like to keep in banks because, over the years, banks had never treated his people too kindly. He counted it carefully, each bill like a wound. Then, with his jaw set and his pride aching, he handed it over. Miller didn't even count it, just slipped it into his jacket and gave Samuel a mock-friendly nod. "Pleasure doing business, Mr. Johnson." And just like that, they were gone. The sound of the patrol car faded into the distance, leaving behind a terrible stillness. Samuel sat back down on the porch, his hands resting on his knees. He felt empty, violated. He had just paid to keep what was already his, and it wasn't the money that hurt the most. It was the knowing that they saw him not as a man, but as someone they could push around. He looked out at the land his father had cleared, the same land he'd hoped to pass to his son one day. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. The next few days passed like a slow-moving storm, and for Samuel, each morning felt heavier than the last. He still woke up early, still walked his land with the same careful steps, but something in him had shifted. His routine felt less like peace, more like a mask. He smiled less, talked less, and even the chickens, who were used to his soft morning chatter, seemed to notice the quiet. Every corner of his farm held memories. The spot near the fence where his wife, Grace, used to plant daisies, the oak tree where his son, as a boy, had carved his initials with a dull pocket knife. These places had once given him strength. Now they reminded him of all he stood to lose. The $2,000 he'd handed over still burned in his mind. He tried to tell himself it was just a one-time thing, that they'd be satisfied and leave him alone, but deep down, he knew better. On the 5th day, they came back. Same car, same men. This time, they didn't bother with fake smiles or friendly tones. Miller got out holding a fresh clipboard. Tucker leaned against the car, arms crossed, watching Samuel like a hawk. "We need to talk about those electrical systems," Miller said. Samuel frowned. "My cousin wired that barn. He's a licensed electrician. Everything's up to code." "Well," Miller said with a shrug, "maybe by last year's standards, things have changed." Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You said this was handled." Miller tilted his head. "Oh, that? That was round 1. This is round 2. Electrical issues, zoning permits, chemical storage. We're just making sure you're safe, Mr. Johnson. You wouldn't want any accidents." He paused, then added, $4,000 should clear this batch. Samuel's voice was dry. "I don't have that kind of money." Tucker smirked. "Then I guess we'll have to start the paperwork for farm shutdown procedures." Samuel said nothing, just stared. Miller looked around the farm, then turned, back to him. "Nice setup you've got here. Be ashamed to lose it over a few $1,000. That evening, Samuel sat in the same chair at the same kitchen table. But this time, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. He took out his old savings book and a notepad. The numbers didn't lie. He'd spent most of the money meant for equipment upgrades, his small emergency fund, and even dipped into what was meant for winter feed. He was proud. Too proud, maybe. But not stupid. He knew what was happening. Knew he was being pushed into a corner. And he also knew he couldn't keep doing this. He tried to focus on work to keep his mind busy, but the cracks were beginning to show. That week, he missed 2 irrigation checks. The tomatoes started yellowing at the edges. A section of the cornfield had pests he didn't catch in time. His rows, usually straight and clean, had weeds creeping in. Small things, but they added up. At Saturday's farmers market, a few loyal customers noticed the change. "Everything all right, Mr. Johnson?" One woman asked gently, looking at the wilted bunch of greens on his table. "Just been a long week," he replied with a tired smile. "That's all." Tommy Parker, the young man who ran the general store, was helping carry a box of produce to an old lady's truck when he caught a glimpse of Samuel standing alone behind his stall. Something about his posture, the sag in his shoulders, the way he stared into the distance, didn't sit right. Later that evening, Tommy stopped by the farm. Samuel wasn't expecting him. He was out by the barn, trying to straighten a busted irrigation pipe when he heard Tommy's truck pull in. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," Tommy called out, stepping down from the cab. "Brought you some new filters you mentioned last week." Samuel stood up slowly. "That's mighty kind of you, son. I didn't expect—" Tommy cut him off, gently. "Can I ask you something straight, Mr. Johnson?" Samuel nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've known you since I was a kid. You taught me how to plant tomatoes, remember? My mama still makes chow-chow from your harvest every year." Samuel chuckled faintly. "I remember." Tommy looked serious now. "But you ain't yourself lately. You look worn down, like something's eating at you." There was a long pause. Samuel looked away, then back at the barn. He wanted to lie, to say it was just age, just the weather, just farm work. But something in Tommy's voice, his honesty, his concern, made it hard to hide. "There's been trouble," Samuel said quietly. "What kind of trouble?" Samuel hesitated. Tommy stepped closer. "Is it the police? I seen them out here more than once lately." Samuel's eyes widened just slightly. Tommy nodded slowly. "I figured, and I don't like it. Don't like the way they look at you. Don't like the way they park out by the diner, laughing like they own this town." Samuel looked tired. "Older than his 78 years? I didn't want to say anything," he finally said. "Didn't want to bring my son into it. He's got his own life. Big job in the city. I can handle it." Tommy's voice softened. "Mr. Johnson, no man should have to handle that kind of thing alone." The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird cried. Samuel nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." He didn't know it yet, but that small moment, that conversation on a quiet night, would be the first step in turning everything around. The evening air had begun to cool, but Samuel still sat outside on the porch, his fingers loosely wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that used to belong to Grace. It was empty, but he held it anyway, like it somehow made him feel less alone. The sun had dipped low, leaving streaks of pink and orange across the sky. But Samuel barely noticed. His thoughts were heavy, like storm clouds that wouldn't pass. He stared out over his land, but didn't really see it. What he saw were the memories. Grace's laughter, Derek running barefoot through the corn rows, family dinners on this very porch. And now? Just him. The wooden floorboards creaked as he shifted in the rocking chair, trying to breathe a little deeper, trying to believe that maybe this would blow over if he just stayed quiet long enough. That's when the phone rang. It was the landline, the one that almost never rang anymore. He stood slowly, every joint reminding him of his age, and stepped inside to answer it. "Hello?" "Hey, Dad." The sound of Derek's voice pulled something loose in his chest. It had been a couple of weeks since they last spoke. Samuel could hear background noise, a faint keyboard clatter, the hum of busy voices. His son was still at work, most likely burning the candle at both ends like he always did. "Evening, son," Samuel said, trying to keep his tone light. "Didn't expect to hear from you tonight." "I just wanted to check in," Derek said. "Tommy Parker gave me a call today. Said you haven't been yourself lately. Said you looked tired, worn down." Samuel swallowed hard and turned toward the window. The barn was just visible in the fading light. "I'm all right. Just, farm's been busy. You know how it is this time of year." There was a pause on the line. Then Derek's voice came, firmer this time. "Dad, I've known you my whole life. I know your voice, and right now you don't sound all right." Samuel said nothing. Tommy said police cars have been out there a lot, more than usual, said they're not just passing through. Still, silence. "Dad, talk to me. What's going on?" Samuel finally sat down at the kitchen table, the old chair creaking under him. He ran a hand over his face, then let out a long sigh. "It started with a traffic stop," he said quietly. "Said my tail light was out. I knew it wasn't. But I kept calm, gave them my papers, thought it would be over quick." Derek didn't speak. He just listened. Then they came to the farm, said there were complaints, violations, things that didn't make sense, told me they'd shut the farm down unless I handled it off the record. First it was 2,000, then 4. Last time they came, it was 3 more. A long silence followed. "Dad." Derek's voice was low now and steady. "That's extortion. That's illegal. Why didn't you call me?" "I didn't want to bring this into your life," Samuel said. "You've worked so hard, son. I didn't want my problems dragging you down." "You're my father," Derek replied. "You raised me. Taught me everything I know. You're not a burden. You're the reason I do what I do." Samuel rubbed his temple. "I just thought, if I kept paying, maybe they'd stop." "They won't, Dad. They never do. People like that, they feed off fear, off silence, and that stops now." Samuel sat up a little straighter. "Son, don't do anything to put yourself in danger. These men, they don't play fair. They won't like being challenged." Derek's tone didn't waver. "They messed with the wrong man this time. I don't care how small the town is or who's looking the other way. They're going to answer for this." Samuel felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not shame. Something else. Hope. "What should I do?" he asked softly. "Next time they come back, don't give them a cent," Derek said. "Just tell them you need time. Stall, keep calm, and let me handle the rest." Samuel nodded, even though Derek couldn't see him. "All right, I'll try." "No," Derek said, gently. "You don't have to try. You just have to hold on. Help is coming, Dad." After the call ended, Samuel stayed seated for a long time. The kitchen was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. His son knew, and that meant he didn't have to face this alone anymore. He stood up and walked slowly to the living room where the family photo still sat on the mantel. Him, Grace, and young Derek, back when the world seemed simpler. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "I told him, Grace. Finally." That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. Not because the problem was gone, but because he had finally stopped carrying it all by himself. And far away in Washington, D.C., Derek Johnson, assistant director at the FBI, was already digging. He opened case files, cross-referenced records, pulled up financial reports. The names Miller and Tucker were already starting to appear more than once, and always in the same context: stops, searches, complaints that went nowhere, and always targeting folks who looked like his father. Derek leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp. He didn't know how deep this went yet, but he was going to find out, because this wasn't just about the law anymore, this was personal. The air that morning was heavy, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Samuel was in his vegetable garden, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants that had started to recover. He had been watching them closely, careful not to let his earlier distractions destroy an entire season's harvest. He wiped sweat from his brow, adjusted the stake beside a younger plant, and tried to focus. Tried not to think about the officers, tried not to think about the phone call with Derek 3 days earlier. But no matter how hard he worked, that unease lingered just behind his thoughts. Then he heard it. Tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate. He froze. He didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. The patrol car rolled to a stop near the barn. Samuel stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, trying to calm the thudding in his chest. He took one deep breath and turned to face them. Miller stepped out first, sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the sun wasn't yet high. Tucker followed, holding that same clipboard he always carried, though Samuel doubted he ever wrote anything real on it. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," Miller said, his voice almost cheerful. "We were in the area, thought we'd drop by." Samuel didn't speak, just watched. Tucker glanced around the property. "Looks like you've been busy. Shame if all this were to go to waste." Miller walked closer, stopping barely a foot from Samuel. "We've got some new concerns. County's been updating their regulations. We'll need to run another inspection." Samuel kept his voice even. "You've already taken $9,000 from me. I don't have anything else to give you." Miller smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "That's unfortunate." He turned and walked over to Samuel's tractor, ran his hand across the hood like he owned it. "This is a nice machine. Your father's, wasn't it?" Samuel's hands tightened at his sides. "Be a real shame if something happened to it." And then, before Samuel could speak, Miller lifted his baton and smashed it down on the control panel. Glass shattered. Pieces of the gauge flew into the dirt. Samuel stepped forward in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Tucker moved to block him. "Careful now, Mr. Johnson. Don't make us add aggression toward an officer to your file." Miller hit the tractor again, then turned to the tool shed and kicked open the door. "Inspection," he said coldly. "Just doing our job." Samuel's voice cracked, low and angry. "You're not officers. You're thieves with badges." Miller walked right up to him. "Watch your mouth, old man. You want to keep your little garden. You'll come up with 2,000 more by Friday. And if I don't, we'll start seizing property. That barn could be condemned. That tractor might need to be impounded. You know how it works." Samuel stood his ground, his chest rising and falling fast, but he didn't move. Not this time. That's when a new voice cut through the tense air. "Touch that barn again and it'll be the last thing you do in uniform." Everyone turned. A man in a dark suit stood near the edge of the driveway, holding a badge high. His voice was calm, but sharp like steel. "Derek." He stepped forward, his FBI credentials clearly visible. His eyes didn't blink, his voice didn't tremble. "Derek Johnson, Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Tucker's hand dropped to his side, and Miller's face changed, confidence bleeding into confusion. Derek walked straight to Samuel's side. "You okay, Dad?" Samuel's throat caught for a second, but he nodded. Miller laughed, trying to brush it off. "What is this? We're just conducting a routine property check. Right, Mr. Johnson?" Derek stepped closer, his tone quiet and cold. "Routine? You mean like the same routine you used at 32 other properties across this county? Same threats? Same cash demands? Same intimidation tactics?" Tucker started backing away. "We don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do." Derek raised his hand and waved once. Suddenly, multiple black SUVs pulled up the dirt road. Doors flew open. Federal agents in jackets marked FBI stepped out, weapons holstered but visible, movements quick and professional. "You're both under federal investigation," Derek said. "Surveillance teams have been monitoring you for weeks. We have financial records, victim statements, and video evidence." Miller's shoulders stiffened, but he tried one last time. "You can't prove anything. This is just harassment." Derek reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a file. "Your personal bank records show regular cash deposits that don't line up with your salary. Some of those deposits were made within hours of visits to known targets, including this farm." Agents moved forward, surrounding Miller and Tucker. They didn't resist, couldn't. The confidence had left their faces. In its place, fear. Samuel watched, his arms folded, saying nothing. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel helpless. He didn't feel alone. He felt protected. As agents cuffed the officers and read them their rights, neighbors began gathering near the fence line, drawn by the flashing lights and quiet commotion. Tommy Parker stood at the front, eyes wide. Miller turned as he was being led away. "You think this changes anything?" Derek didn't even look at him. "It already has." When the agents were gone and the patrol car was just dust on the road, Derek turned to his father. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," he said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "You came when it mattered." They stood together in the dirt, father and son, on the land that had tried to break under pressure, but didn't. Derek looked around the damaged equipment. "We'll fix this. I've already spoken to the Bureau. There's help coming, not just legal, but financial support too. Repairs, restoration, investigations across the county." Samuel looked at his son, pride and relief mixing in his tired eyes. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "You raised me to know right from wrong," Derek replied. "This place, this town, needed someone to stand up." Samuel took a long breath and nodded. "Well, we stood." The morning after the arrests, the sun rose just like it always did. But something felt different in the air. It wasn't just that Miller and Tucker were gone. It was the way the birdsong sounded, clearer, the way the wind didn't feel so heavy. Or maybe, Samuel thought as he sipped his coffee on the porch, maybe it was just hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time, moving quietly through the trees. He'd been up since dawn, not because he had chores to do, though he always did, but because he couldn't sleep. Not after everything that had happened the day before. Not after watching his son, standing tall in a dark suit, protect the very land Samuel had nearly lost. He still couldn't believe it. For weeks, he'd carried the weight of fear and shame on his back, trying to keep it from the world, especially from Derek. And in the end, it was Derek who brought the light that scattered all that darkness away. But the biggest surprise came later that morning. Around 8 a.m., the first car pulled up. Then another. Then another. By mid-morning, his driveway looked like a Sunday picnic. People from town, people he hadn't spoken to in years, folks who usually looked the other way at the grocery store, were now walking up the steps of his porch with casseroles, toolboxes, and quiet apologies. Tommy Parker was the first to speak. "Mr. Johnson, this town owes you more than we can say. You stood up when the rest of us were too scared to. Let us help now." Samuel was speechless. He nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat, and stepped back as folks began to move around his property like they belonged there. Bill Whitaker, who had barely looked him in the eye at the market just weeks ago, was now on his knees fixing the wiring on the old tractor Miller had damaged. "I used to think silence kept me safe," Bill said without looking up. "Turns out it just made things worse." Samuel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just passed the man a wrench and patted his shoulder once, gently. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Harrison, the retired schoolteacher who once walked across the street to avoid him, was organizing lunch for the volunteers. She brought her famous peach cobbler and a folding table, which she set up under the shade tree like she'd done it 100 times before. "This place has always fed the town," she said as she chopped vegetables. "Now it's time the town feeds it." By the afternoon, the barn had a fresh coat of paint, the fencing had been repaired, and the broken tools were lined up neatly for cleaning. The damage Miller and Tucker had done was being erased, not just physically, but in spirit. More than once, Samuel had to step away just to breathe. The emotions came in waves: gratitude, relief, a quiet kind of joy he hadn't felt in years. Derek walked beside him, watching it all unfold. "They're not just fixing the farm," Derek said quietly. "They're fixing themselves too." Samuel nodded. Funny how pain can bring people together. You just hope it lasts. And it seemed like it might, because as word spread about the FBI arrests, more people came forward. The Martinez family, who ran the Mexican restaurant in town, revealed how the same officers had threatened to shut them down over fire code issues. They had paid $5,000 in cash just to keep their business open. Mr. Chun, who had run the same corner store for over 20 years, told agents about the strange visits he got, always ending in suspicious consulting fees the officers demanded. Even Mrs. Jenkins, a widowed grandmother who owned a small hair salon out of her converted garage, said the officers had warned her she'd be shut down for zoning violations if she didn't pay up. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, and each one brought the town closer together. The FBI set up a temporary command post on Samuel's porch. Agents walked the property, took statements, and helped victims file formal complaints. A few of the neighbors helped pass out water bottles and clipboards. The mayor eventually showed up. His face was pale, his voice tight. "I had no idea this was happening," he said, avoiding everyone's eyes. Tommy, who had never been one for public speaking, stepped forward. "With all due respect, sir, folks tried to report this many times. They were ignored. The mayor had no answer." He left quietly an hour later. The next morning, he resigned. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the farm, Samuel stood beside Derek near the porch steps, watching the volunteers clean up. "I don't know what I expected," Samuel said. "But it wasn't this? Not all this kindness?" "It's not kindness, Dad," Derek said softly. "It's justice. Real justice. The kind that grows slowly. The kind you've been planting your whole life without even knowing it." Samuel looked out over the land. His land. He had nearly lost it, but now it felt more alive than ever. Not just because the weeds were being pulled or the barn was being repainted, but because of the people. Neighbors who once ignored him were now working side by side, sharing food, fixing fences, talking like old friends. The lines that once divided them, color, class, fear, were fading into something better, something whole. That night, after the last car pulled away and the stars came out, Samuel sat on his porch again, this time with Derek beside him. A lantern glowed between them. The sounds of crickets and distant frogs filled the quiet. "You think it's really over?" Samuel asked. Derek took a sip from his glass. "Not over, but different, safer, better. And we're going to make sure it stays that way." Samuel nodded slowly. "You know," he said, looking out into the fields. "Grace used to say something I didn't understand back then." "What's that?" She'd say, "Sometimes the world breaks you open, just so something better can grow." Derek smiled. She was a wise woman. Samuel leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under him. She really was. And for the first time in a long, long time, Samuel Johnson looked out at his land, not with worry, but with peace. He hadn't just saved his farm. He'd helped heal a town. 3 months had passed since the day everything changed. The air had shifted with the season. Autumn had arrived, painting Samuel's land with deep reds, soft golds, and the earthy scent of turned soil. The fields stretched wide and full, the kind of full that comes not just from crops, but from effort, love, and the hands of a community that had decided to stand together. Samuel walked slowly down the row of pumpkins the local school children had planted back in September. Behind him, laughter echoed from the yard, kids tossing leaves into the air, teachers chatting under the big pecan tree, Mrs. Harrison handing out warm apple cider like it was the most natural thing in the world. A few months ago, this farm had been a place of silence, a place where Samuel feared the sound of tires on gravel. Now it was alive again, and not just alive, thriving. After the arrests of Officers Miller and Tucker, more than 50 townspeople came forward with stories, some heartbreaking, some infuriating, but all necessary. Their courage gave weight to the investigation Derek had started, and their testimony made the case airtight. In court, both officers had taken plea deals that would keep them behind bars for years. They were also ordered to pay restitution, and though no amount of money could erase the damage they'd done, it sent a message that justice had finally come to Spencer County, and justice didn't stop with them. The sheriff resigned. The old system, built on fear and silence, was torn down piece by piece. In its place, something new was being planted. Derek, true to his word, had taken a position at the FBI's Atlanta field office just a few hours away. He visited regularly, sometimes bringing his son, Samuel's grandson, who had recently been accepted into college to study agricultural science, said he wanted to help modernize the farm, though Samuel joked that nothing needed fixing, that had survived 2 hurricanes and 3 generations. Still, it warmed his heart to see the boy walking his rows, asking questions, just like Derek used to. But what meant more than anything was this: Samuel was no longer alone. He no longer bore the weight of protecting the land by himself. Every week, neighbors came to help. Some harvested, some painted, some just brought pie and stayed to talk. Samuel's porch, once quiet, now felt like the beating heart of something bigger. One afternoon, as the wind rustled through the trees and the leaves danced across the soil, Tommy Parker arrived with a camera crew. "Farmers Market Committee wants you to say a few words, Mr. Johnson," he said. "For the Harvest Festival video." Samuel laughed under his breath. "You sure they want an old man who barely knows how to work a smartphone to be on camera?" "Sir," Tommy said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you didn't just rebuild a farm. You rebuilt trust in this town. People look up to you now." Samuel looked at the young man for a long moment. "All right then," he said, adjusting his old cap. "Let's give them something worth hearing." The camera rolled, and Samuel spoke, not with polished words or rehearsed lines, but straight from the heart, about fear, about standing tall even when your knees shake, about the power of community, and the truth that sometimes you don't win by fighting harder. You win by holding on just long enough for help to arrive. His voice trembled only once, when he mentioned Grace. "She believed in people," he said softly, "even when they didn't believe in themselves. And now, I think maybe she was right." When the shoot was over, Samuel stood quietly for a moment, staring at the rows of crops stretching out in front of him. Then he turned and walked back, toward the house. That night, after everyone had gone home and the lights in the fields had been turned off, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand and a clean sheet of paper. He took a deep breath and began writing. "Dear Grace, you always said I was too proud to ask for help, and you were right. I thought carrying pain alone made me strong. But these last few months, I've learned something different. True strength comes from letting people in. From trusting your son to carry part of your burden. From letting neighbors who once turned away now stand beside you with paintbrushes and open hearts. From watching old enemies become new friends. Our boy, he's something special. I know you already knew that. You'd be proud of the man he's become. He brought justice here. He gave me back my voice. And this land, it's changing. Not just in crops or buildings, but in spirit. They're planting something new out here. Something we didn't always believe we'd see. Fairness, respect, peace. Even your jasmine vine is blooming again. It grew wild this year. Wrapped itself around the porch rail, almost like it was reaching for the sun. Just like we are, always reaching. Love always, Samuel. A week later, Samuel stood at the edge of his field as the sun set. The wind carried the soft scent of fresh soil and apples. Behind him, laughter still rang from the house where volunteers shared stories over dinner. He closed his eyes for a moment, let the wind touch his face. He had lost things. He had suffered, but in the end, he had not been broken. Instead, his roots had gone deeper, his branches had grown wider, and now his legacy stretched farther than his farm, into the hearts of those around him, into the choices they'd make, and into the kind of town they were building together. As night settled gently across the land, fireflies rose from the fields, blinking softly in the dark. And Samuel Johnson stood tall, stronger than fear, surrounded by light. His story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a seed, and it had taken root.